this video, I'm going to be walking you guys through a photo editing session and show you how I turn this image from this to this. Now, this video will be very beneficial for beginners. And while editing this photo, I'm also going to let you guys know some mistakes that I made when I first started editing photos and how to avoid them moving forward. The first thing I usually start doing when I'm editing photos is, like in this case, I assess the surrounding, and as you can see, there's a little light in the corner here. Also, the first step for this would be to crop that in first. And obviously there's a little bit too much negative space here. So what we'd want to do here is crop that in. Now, cropping that in would basically allow us to focus more on the image. And as you can see with these lines here, you can also play with the rule of thirds a bit. So to have this line right here align with where eye is, so right there. You are allowed to break some of these rules sometimes when it comes to photo editing. So I can lift this up a bit. I don't know, I like a bit of negative space sometimes in my images. I don't know, it gives it a certain feel sometimes. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do here, before I adjust the temperature of the image. Now, the temperature of the image basically is how warm or how cold your image looks. So the more you move it towards the right side, the warmer your image gets. And the more you move it towards the left, the colder your image gets. In this case, especially when editing darker skin, I like to make it a bit warmer. I feel like it makes the skin tone pop a bit more. And so you see, as you can see, I'm paying attention to the skin. The skin, the more you move towards the left, the colder the skin looks. So I'll be moving this towards the right a bit more. And you can see how our skin starts looking a bit more golden. Now, obviously, when you're shooting, you should pay attention to these details a bit more when you're shooting and when you're adjusting your white balance in camera. That's one of the most important parts of any photo. You have to get it right in camera first before you try getting it right in the editing. So the next thing I'm going to do here is actually reduce my contrast. Earlier in this video, I told you guys I'll be telling you some mistakes that I made. And one of the biggest mistakes that I made in my photography career was I actually never reduced my contrast. It was just this default to me that I felt like anytime that I'm adjusting my contrast, I would always have to increase it. I'm going to be reducing the contrast a bit here. Now you can see that what this does is it reveals a bit more, it leaves the shadows a bit more. You can see more of the actual image itself. Meanwhile, previously it was a bit too shadowy. So we are going to be, let me adjust this back and then reduce our contrast again. So the next thing here is lifting up the shadows and the highlights. The highlights are for the lighter side of your image and the shadows are for the darker parts of your image. As you can see that I haven't touched exposure yet. Most times I like making adjustments to my highlights and my shadows first. I always go to exposure as the final ground, because sometimes your highlights and your shadows, adjusting that can be enough sometimes. So that's what I recommend when you're editing photos. More than half the time, you have to adjust your highlights and your shadows first and then see how that affects your photo. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. And then, yeah. Next thing is the blacks. I'm going to be lifting up the blacks a bit. And then once I look at the final image and I feel like the exposure, that's when I start adjusting the exposure a tiny bit. Half the time, if you get exposure right in camera, you might actually not ever need to touch it. You might just need to do adjustments in your highlights, shadows, and your tone curves. If with clarity, you don't want to go overboard with it because your image just ends up looking weird. So I never take my clarity above 10. You can just keep it at 5 for this image. And then I never touch texture or the haze. I don't feel like I ever need it for my creative process. If this is something that you feel like you might want to include in your photo editing process, then you can go ahead with it. For the vibrance, you're going to be adding a bit of vibrance to our image. The difference between vibrance and saturation is this. With vibrance, where you're using the software to increase the colors of colors that may look dull already. So vibrance doesn't necessarily affect every single color in the image. So it's kind of like your way of trying to even out the saturation of each color. Does that make sense? So vibrance doesn't affect every single color in the image. Meanwhile, saturation does the exact opposite, where it affects every color in the image. Like everything gets increased at the same level, but vibrance kind of like helps you match up. So as you can see here, the blue dress that she's wearing isn't that like vibrant. So what we are doing here is increasing the vibrance, and as you can see here, it's affecting mostly the blue, because the blue here is the color that needs to pop a bit more. I hope that isn't confusing. I'm just going to keep it somewhere around there. With the tone curve, here's what we're going to be doing. The way I'll summarize it for anyone that is new to photo editing is this. With the tone curve, this affects your blacks. This is your shadows, and it kind of adds a bit of contrast too. This is your midtones. This is your highlights. Remember, it's the brightest part of your image. So if you lift it up, it lifts your highlights. If you bring it down, it brings down your highlights. And then these are your whites. This end of the tone curve is for your whites. This end of the tone curve is for your blacks. I'm going to lift up the blacks to give it a bit of that faded look. And if you notice throughout this video, I'm also zooming in at some points to look closely, because what matters here is the focus, which is the model's skin tone and like how well she's lit through the entire editing. You can always click here to see the before and after. All we have done so far is the basic adjustments of brightening the image. So I'm going to lift up the shadows a bit, and the midtones tiniest bit to just make her skin pop a bit more, and then the highlights tiny bit as well. 90% of the time, after I'm done with the tone curve and the basic adjustments, I usually actually go back to my exposure. I've reduced the exposure a tiny bit. Here is where things get a bit more interesting. Now with these other parts of the tone curve, there's your red channel, your green channel, and your blue channel. If you lift this up, you're adding more reds to your image. If you lift this down, you're adding more blues. Same thing with this. If you lift this up, you're adding more greens. If you lift this down, if you take this down, you're adding more magenta to your image. Same with this as well. If you lift this up, you're adding more blues. If you lift this down, you take this down, you're adding more yellows to your image. Now with the blue channel, we've also added the points in the highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, and midtones. I'm going to be reducing this a tiny bit. One thing I always look out for is the input and output here. This like kind of like shows you the intensity of what you're doing. So I'm going to reset that, and then I'll zoom in because I don't want it to affect the skin too much. So a tiny bit of that, and then I'm going to be lifting the blues and adding a bit more, and adding more blues to the blacks. So you can see now that we've started giving this image a look, the look and feel that we want. This is before, this is after. You can see how much change that the tone curve has done to this image. So the next thing we're going to be doing there is leaving it there and then moving on to HSL. I'll give you guys a basic overview of what HSL is. This is hue, saturation, and luminance. Luminance is you adjust how bright or how dark each color is in the image. So if you can see, if I move this here, it gives the darker blue. I think this is kind of cool. But if I move this here, it gives the lighter blue. This is actually an interesting look, but I'm not going to move it here because I really want it to. This kind of makes our skin pop a bit more, but I really like the look that this blue has already. So I already want the dress to pop, so I'm going to move it up a bit here. Then with saturation, same thing saturation. Remember we explained saturation earlier. With saturation, it's like how much of that color you want in your image, or how much of each of these colors you want in your image. I'm just actually going to, if we move to the left side here with this, I'm going to reduce the saturation of the greens, because I feel like she'll pop out of the image more, and the green was a bit too distracting. So in the hue, I like to play around with the hue of my blues to see what look I can get from it, but I'm going to reduce it a tiny bit. So I'm going to be reducing the hue of my reds. On the red channel, it starts adding this bit of like a golden look to our skin. Remember that your skin color is usually made up of colors like red, yellow, and orange. So playing around with each of these colors can kind of like affect the way your skin looks. So you can see before and after the HSL. I kind of like how it looks right now. You can see how far we have gone from the original image. The next thing I'm going to be doing here is the color grading. With color grading, we can do like an entire video on this, but if you're a complete beginner, a quick tip I can give you guys is this. Whatever colors that you apply for your shadows, you can try to do the opposite for the highlights. So example is if I'm using blues for the highlights, the shadows can face the opposite way. Using this technique kind of like gives you an interesting look sometimes. So yeah, that's like a good rule of thumb when it comes to color grading. And you know what, I'm actually going to do just that. See before and after. You can get like lots of interesting look by doing that. So for the shadows, I think I'm actually going to go the opposite route. Since we already added some blues to the blacks in the tone curve, this is what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to be adding a bit of bluish purple, like somewhere here, to the shadows. And obviously, the more you bring it out of the midpoint here, the more intense that color is going to be. So yeah, I'm liking the look so far. And then for the highlights, I'm going to do like the direct opposite of that. So that's like, for beginners, that's a good rule of thumb to follow. It's almost like a cheat code in a way, because most of the time it ends up giving you an interesting look and it kind of works. So we have the warm highlights with the cool shadows. If you want more details on any of these topics, you can let me know in the comments below. There is sharpening. I like to add a bit of sharpening sometimes, keep it around 50. If I'm trying to make an image look more moody, something I try to do is reduce my vignette. I feel like reducing my vignette brings a bit more focus to the person in the picture. And then for the calibration, this is what I usually do. The values I usually use, it kind of adds that slightly bit of orange and teal look and makes the skin look a bit more golden. Then I'm going to reduce this a bit more. You have come a long way with this image. I've done a lot of adjustments and I really like how this image turned out. So this is another quick before and after, where I've like really given this that moody and like fantasy look that we're going for with this image. If you like this video and want some presets that you can work with, you can check the link in the description below. Thank you for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one.